Hello, I'm Steve Vanderheiden. I'm a visiting fellow at the Carson Center. I'm also a professor of political science and environmental studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder in the US. And I'm trained as a political theorist, so I'm here to introduce a project that I'm starting this summer while here in residence at the Carson Center, called The Politics and Ethics of Visible Carbon. This particular presentation focuses on the politics of visible carbon. So thanks to the Carson Center for making my visit possible, and to the production team here for making this presentation look better than it probably should. So a bit about the idea of visibility and invisibility of carbon might begin with a question. Is carbon, is it visible? And what follows from this? So what? Of course, carbon as a material, as an atom, is not visible. It's something that we can't see, but it's something that can be rendered visible. And by visible, I don't mean merely reference to its physicality or materiality, but to its cognitive or ontological reality, that it's real to us, that it exists as we interact with it. And its reality would manifest through our interactions with carbon. Carbon, particularly in the form of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that we emit when we combust fossil fuels or otherwise engage in activities that contribute toward climate change. And the visibility of carbon is a question that's related to, but distinct from, whether climate change, or more particularly anthropogenic or human-caused climate change, is visible. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And what I'm especially focused on is not whether carbon or carbon dioxide is visible, empirically observable through our senses, particularly visually, but whether it's visualizable, whether we can capture it by visualizing it and give it a kind of reality. And I take this distinction between the visible and the visualizable from Rudyard Gould in 2013. And if it can be made visible, even if it's not born so, then the question is how we make carbon visible, how we give it this reality, this ontological or cognitive reality, so it becomes real to us. Now, on the question of the visibility or invisibility of climate change, there's an active debate now among scientists and humanities scholars as to whether or not we can see empirically whether the effects of climate change are visible to persons that experience it. And famously on the science side, the geographer Mike Hume said back in his 2009 book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, that climate change is something that we can't see. No one, Hume wrote, can see climate change or feel it happening. And this is based on the observation that climate is a rather abstract phenomenon, that it's distinct from weather, that it's something which is inherently global. Whether humans are changing the climate or not, it's not something that we can observe with our senses alone. It takes the collection and analysis of data. And a common way of expressing this we can see here in a report from the American Psychological Association. While a region's climate and changes in its climate obviously determine its weather patterns, weather events, even extreme ones, are not necessarily diagnostic of changes in the climate. Climate change is a trend in averages and extremes of temperature, precipitation, and other parameters that are embedded in a lot of variability, making it very difficult to identify them from personal experience. People often falsely attribute unique events to climate change and also fail to detect changes in climate. Climate change is not just something that's not available, at least to most people, cognitively, as something that we can observe. It's probabilistic, rather than determinative. If we see a weather event, and those kinds of impacts are something that we can experience with our senses, there's some causal ambiguity. We don't know whether or not this was caused by some set of human activities, whether it was an anthropogenic weather event, or whether we merely raised the probabilities of those events happening. But this particular one was one that might have happened regardless of human inputs. Or as Hume puts it in another paper from 2010, it is as irrelevant as it is impossible to find the invisible fault line between natural and artificial climate. On the other hand, it's highly relevant how we respond to the changing climatic risks and opportunities yielded by such hybridity. And that's what I'm interested in, how we respond to changes in climatic risk on the basis of how we visualize carbon. So how do we render climate change visible? And I'll return to how we might render carbon as a driver or as a material that contributes to climate change visible. So as I said previously, climate change is something which is visualizable. We can capture it with visual images. And how we characterize or portray or visualize climate change affects its meaning, affects how we think about it, ultimately affects what we do about it. Back in 2005, Bill McKibben, the US climate change activist, had this to say about visualizing climate change. He wrote, "An intellectual understanding of the scientific facts was not enough. By 2005, we had a lot of scientific facts about climate change, and they weren't moving people to transformative actions." He goes on, "If we wanted to move forward and affect meaningful change, we needed to engage the other side of our brains. We needed to approach the problem with our imagination. And the people best suited to help us do that, he believed, were the artists." And he was calling upon artists and others that work in visual fields to represent or to visualize climate change. And there have been many ways in which artists responded to this kind of call. This is an installation of knitting on the global temperature record going back to the 1950s that visualizes how annual temperatures have changed on the planet. This is a similar kind of visualization of climate change as an art installation where the bluer colors show cooler average global temperatures, and as we move outward toward the present, the outer rings with more red colors represent or visualize increasing average global temperatures, which visualizes a long-term pattern of changes in temperature or climate change itself. And of course, a lot of visualization of climate change takes the form of dystopic or even apocalyptic art, like this visualization of a kind of climate disaster where only the top of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor is above the sea level. So there are a lot of ways to render climate change visible, and important projects of trying to represent in a visual way, often through art, but it can be represented through data as well, climate change. I'm interested in this project on how we might render carbon visible. And I'm wary of some potential problems with the visualization of carbon, and so the project is really about trying to avoid those kind of problems. In an article on the use of carbon offsets in a developing country context in Indonesia, W.B. Miles had this observation to say about carbon, which he called the invisible commodity. Carbon will be seen, will become visual or visualized as a resource to those that believe they can benefit from it. When it becomes a commodity, it becomes visible. And there's an extensive literature in political science and other social sciences about the commodification of carbon, a lot of pitfalls associated with that market-based approach to trying to control carbon emissions that I'll talk about just very briefly here. But carbon is made visible when it becomes a commodity because it's an intangible good. It requires some kind of signifier in order to create or instantiate value in carbon itself or in sequestered carbon, which creates the carbon offset. It's visualized through this offset, which then becomes a commodity, can be bought and sold as we offset our carbon from airline travel or businesses seek to become carbon neutral. The collection of carbon offsets, the trading of carbon offsets, disclosure and transparency requirements that make carbon footprints available and which make carbon neutrality pledges a kind of goal of a lot of different kinds of organization are part of a neoliberal approach to environmental governance, which is another kind of problem that I want to just identify and try and wall off from the approach that I'm taking. This is the logo of the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is an international NGO that helps companies track their carbon, create visualizations of their carbon footprints, and ultimately reduce their carbon impacts. The impact and disvalue associated with carbon footprints is also something which is made available through the carbon footprint analysis, a kind of visualization of the impact that individual persons or organizations, collectivities like entire countries, can show the carbon associated with their various activities, the carbon emissions or contributions to climate change through release of carbon from combustion of fossil fuels. And so this takes us to the part of the presentation that's implied in the title, the politics of visible carbon. And as I mentioned, I have a related project that I'll be talking about later during my stay that's on the ethics of visible carbon. But on the politics of visible carbon, I just want to start with an observation. And that's that means or media that we use for visualizing carbon can create value, as in the carbon offset, which becomes a valuable commodity, or can create disvalue, can reduce the value of some things because they have a lot of embedded carbon in them. And they can also affect power, values, and norms in important ways. And let me give some examples. There's, of course, the quest for carbon neutrality, which has become an important objective of a lot of private sector businesses. This from Hitachi claiming that because they've purchased carbon offsets, that they have yielded value through their decarbonizing activities equivalent to having planted 100,000 cedar trees. I'm saying their corporate decarbonization or sustainability efforts have an equivalent value to creating substantial new forests. Or a mining company claiming that because it's mined enough uranium to replace the equivalent in fossil fuels from 100 million cars being on the road, that in effect it's created that much in value or averted contributions to climate change, both depending upon the equivalence between a carbon offset and some kind of sequestration activity or averted or avoided combustion of fossil fuels. Something which, again, is embroiled in controversy about how this commodification of carbon leads to patterns of carbon colonialism, first world or developed country ownership of forests in the global south or developing countries. And this representing concerns about the reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation program, REDD, which is part of the UN's carbon trading or carbon offsetting system. Some other examples, a product carbon footprint label from a loaf of bread, claiming that the bread has the equivalent of a kilogram of embedded carbon and pledging to reduce that even more. Carbon that the consumer of the loaf of bread then releases into the environment. That's their contribution to climate change through the production, the transportation, the packaging associated with the loaf of bread. Another product carbon footprint label, which then also includes a climate score from A to E, allowing consumers then to make value judgments about what kind of products they might buy and consume on the basis of their relative merits in sustainability imperatives. Or in comparing diets, here I'm showing the carbon that's embedded, or the carbon footprint embedded in different kinds of things that we might eat. A steak dinner on the one hand, and tofu stir fry, which gives us an equivalent amount of nutrition and protein, on the other hand, with the former involving a much larger carbon footprint. Again, that visualization of carbon creates value or disvalue around different kinds of food choices that we might make. Some other examples from university sustainability efforts, showing historical progress toward carbon reduction goals, visualizing the carbon footprint of the university, or within a given year, showing how different kinds of activities that the universities engage in have different carbon footprints. Again, creating value or disvalue associated with those different kinds of activities, and implicitly raising questions about those activities that have the largest footprints. Of course, we can ask ourselves, and we can use calculators found on the internet to try and determine our own carbon footprints. What is it that we do, not just in our capacities as consumers, but in all of our capacities to create carbon or to emit carbon dioxide? Or what do different countries do, and how does this compare to their size? I'm from the US, a country with less than 5% of the world's population, now responsible for nearly 17% of its annual carbon emissions. When we visualize carbon in this way, we start to introduce questions about equity, which is something that I'm interested in this project. So let me just say a few words about the project. It has three premises that I'll just introduce and then say a little bit about what it is that I hope to do. The first premise, that the invisibility of carbon, when we can't see it, when it doesn't exist for us, it has no ontological or epistemic reality. It just doesn't cognitively occur to us that we're interacting with carbon in any way. When it's invisible in this sense, that invisibility causes us to underestimate the disvalue associated with our interactions with carbon, especially our carbon emissions. The second premise, and this is one that I've been talking about for the last few minutes, that visualizing carbon creates meaning. It can create value or disvalue. It can affect norms of what we do, how we transport ourselves, what we eat, how we consume. And it can reallocate power, resources, and impacts from the way that they're presently allocated. And then finally, premise three, that the visualization of carbon, the rendering it visible, should attend to imperatives of equity and justice. And it should convey accurate and usable information that's capable of mobilizing transformative change without misleading the recipients of that visualization, those who see or in some way process the information about carbon once it's visualized. So the project involves examining a variety of different kinds of means for visualizing carbon, whether that's footprint calculators, product or organization carbon labels, whether it involves carbon pricing schemes, or the creation of graphical representation of carbon dioxide emissions as they're released or as we interact with them in other ways. But it's to examine means for visualizing carbon in these terms. That is, in terms of equity, of usability, of justice, of accuracy, and so on. And I'll finish with this slide about carbon visualization and meaning making to say a little bit about what it is that I'm interested in particularly. So two questions here. First, how to convey embeddedness, that we're embedded in a world in which we interact with carbon all the time. Urgency, agency, and equity. When it comes to embeddedness, we ought to represent or visualize carbon in a way that shows our symbiotic but lopsided relationship with the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle, I mean that when we, for example, combust fossil fuels, they're using energy, we're releasing carbon that's been stored in those fossil fuels, often for thousands or even millions of years. It's a lopsided relationship that we have now in that we're releasing a lot more stored carbon than we're able to store now, which is why we're experiencing elevated carbon levels and ultimately climate change. But to show that embeddedness, to show that in all the ways that we interact with the world, we're also interacting with carbon. But not uniformly so. We're doing it in different sorts of ways. Allows us to cognitively appreciate those interactions. To convey urgency, the visualization of carbon has to in some way convey the pace of change that humans have been engaging in, especially over this past half century. The stickiness of energy transition, that is, the time that it takes to transform the way that we produce energy, to move away from carbon-based fuels and toward sustainable or zero carbon ones, as well as conveying the harm potential, that we need to really change course if we're to avoid some of the worst effects of climate change. How to convey agency, that actors, whether individual or organizational, have the ability to meaningfully change this direction. Depends upon emphasis on links between actions and emissions, between persons and groups, between decisions or non-decisions and outcomes. And it has to deliver usable information. It has to allow us to see the potential for interacting with carbon in a different way, and in so doing, producing a different kind of world. To convey equity, we could show or visualize disparities in emissions patterns not unlike the ones that I showed when it came to national emissions just a couple of slides back, or disparity in carbon impacts. Or equity can often be brought out by the finitude of budgeting, that we're on a carbon budget, so more use or more emissions by any one actor necessarily means fewer for another. And then the second question, and the one that I'll finish with, something that I've been concerned with and interested in as a scholar for a long time, that's how visualizing carbon instantiates responsibility, a sense of responsibility for carbon footprints. And here there are two dimensions. First, it should in some way fairly attribute the agency or the responsibility for carbon removal or avoidance in order to encourage mitigation. If I really am reducing my carbon or if I'm sequestering it, the visualization of carbon should show that in an accurate way that captures the good that I've done in order to do my part in trying to mitigate climate change. But then, in addition, and perhaps more importantly, it should also allow us to fairly attribute liability for carbon pollution. We should be able to see how we or others, whether individual or collective, are contributing toward climate change, so that we can hold responsible parties responsible, and we can do so in an equitable manner. And so the project will again be looking at ways in which we visualize carbon, trying to understand their meaning, trying to understand the stories that they tell, the narratives that they involved, the value or the disvalue that they create, and then to try and direct these toward a more equitable world in which we interact with carbon on a just and equitable basis, whether individually or collectively. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.